Okay, so the last speaker in this session is Donna Guerrari, and she will be talking about investigating the influence of data familiarity to improve design of a crowdsourcing image annotation system.
It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm presenting this work on behalf of myself, as well as my friend Becky sitting up there, and Margaret today. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the process of annotation. So given an image, the goal is to pull out the most prominent object from that image. And this object could fall under various categories, ranging from animals, plants, foods, tools, etc. Well, if you look in the literature, first to show you what this task looks like with the crowd, this is a popular tool called LabelMe, which has been cited over 1,800 times, and is widely used to go ahead and collect these types of segmentations, and moreover, it reflects the wider methodology employed to collect boundaries of objects. So these are just clicks around the boundary of an object. So if you look into the prior work about crowdsourcing the collection of these segmentations, what you'll find is that it's often stated that it's difficult to collect high-quality segmentations from the crowd. So you might read quotes like, only 70,000 segmentations are deemed good out of 105,000, so about 33% of the results are getting discarded. Other literature states most workers only produce a coarse outline resulting in poor segmentations. Well, this work is inspired by my realization, or by the following question, which is, why did our crowd match expert quality when we did this task? And the key observation is the data that we were working with is biomedical data. In other words, this data is unfamiliar to the crowd. And prior work, predominantly, is working with familiar data, material that's familiar to a crowd. And so one of the questions that we had, which prompted this work, is, could the data familiarity be the hidden secret for our success? It turns out this question of looking at the influence of familiarity actually is not new. If you look in the psychology literature, for over 20 years, people have been exploring what is the influence of familiarity. So one example is with studies showing babies about 6 months old, when they start to perceive and recognize objects, show the baby a picture of his or her mother, flip the image of the picture of his or her mother upside down, and what has been found is that showing someone something familiar versus less familiar, an upside-down image, actually alters the perception from even children. So this is something at a young age we start to decipher and react differently to familiar versus unfamiliar data. The influence of familiarity is also been explored in the art community. So a New York Times best-selling book has actually promoted how to draw better, and it's a very simple trick. If you want to copy a picture of an image, take the image you want to copy, put it upside down, take your paper and pencil and start drawing, and instantly you'll be a better drawer. So this is the idea. For our work, we wanted to explore this in the crowdsourcing space for the segmentation task, and in particular, I will present 3 research questions that we explored. First, how does the segmentation quality compare for familiar versus unfamiliar image content? Second, can artificially reducing the image familiarity improve the segmentation quality? And finally, how does the familiarity of the data influence the perceived ambiguity of the foreground object? So diving into the first research question of how does the segmentation quality compare for familiar versus unfamiliar image content? So our experimental design was as follows. We had 2 publicly available data sets we employed, which each come with images showing a single object. One set includes 305 biomedical images, which we use as our unfamiliar data. The other data set includes 100 familiar images. And what we did is we collected 5 crowd drawings for every single one of those images. And what we asked the crowd workers to do is to demarcate the object which is the biggest and closest to the center of the image. Then for every single crowd drawing, we evaluated it. The standard pipeline for doing this is given an image, compare the crowd drawing against the expert established ground truth using an evaluation score. And for this study, we used what we call the intersection over union score, often also called the Jaccard index. So just to illustrate pictorially what this means, you look at the number of pixels in common, or in other words, in dark green, over the total number of pixels, or the dark green, the light green, and the black pixels. And what you find is a similarity of 70% between the crowd drawn and the ground truth. So this is our evaluation metric. And our results come from 52 unique workers for the biomedical images and 44 unique workers for everyday images. So what we found in the study is that there are more errors on biomedical images than everyday images when the IOU score is above 0.7. So when you have 70% pixel overlap, we do find that typically the crowd does better. However, these type of errors reflect complex boundaries. And if you actually look at the agreement between experts, you also find the same trend, which is the experts will have lower agreement in this space for biomedical images than everyday images. These aren't the kind of errors that we deem egregious. These are due to innocent mistakes where, it's just a level of detail and agreement on that. What we did find of particular interest is when we looked at when there's less than 40% pixel overlap, or an IOU score of less than 0.4. These types of errors were occurring 3 times more often on everyday images than biomedical images. And just to illustrate to you what these types of errors look like, I show the image, a ground truth, followed by the crowdsourced drawing. And the IOU score here, it shows this 32% pixel overlap. So hopefully what should be clear is these kind of errors are arising because there's ambiguity. There's disagreement about what is the foreground object. So from the study, what our key findings are is that the crowd workers made more egregious errors for everyday images than biomedical images because of ambiguity. And moreover, what we hypothesized is that crowd workers are making more egregious errors on everyday images because the content is familiar. So this leads into the next research question that we explored, which is, can artificially reducing the image familiarity improve the segmentation quality? So we conducted a study to explore this question where we took our 100 upright images and we used those as our familiar images, and we flipped those 100 upright images upside down, and that's how we reduced the quality to make them less familiar. We collected 5 crowd-drawn segmentations per image for the 100 upright and the 100 upside-down images. And we gave the same instructions as before. Please demarcate the object, which is the biggest and closest to the center of the image. Then to evaluate, for each of the crowdsourced segmentations, we looked at how much time did it take the crowd worker to finish the boundary of the object, how many points the person used when clicking the boundary of the object, and we again used the same quality score that we had used before, looking at the intersection over the union. And what we found when we did significance testing to compare the results from the crowdsourced segmentations for the upright and upside down images is as follows. We observed significantly higher quality segmentations. In addition, we observed that the crowd workers took less time per segmentation, and they also used fewer points per segmentation. So what we hypothesize is that the actual act of recognizing the content is introducing extra mental processing that is causing for people to take longer, and also perhaps causing them to bring more incomplete opinions because they're thinking more about what they're doing. We still had a few egregious errors left, and we were curious what was going on when the images were upside down. And what we found are as follows. These are the majority of the remaining egregious errors. And what we found is typically the crowd workers seem to be reliable. I should say reliable. So one thing I want to note is that for the eggs case, flipping that image upside down doesn't necessarily distort recognition. So perhaps that's part of why we still have some remaining ambiguous cases. So what we found from this is that we got fewer errors with significantly less effort when annotating less familiar or upside down images. And just to give you a sense of what this means, at the scale of 100,000 segmentations, this would translate to higher quality segmentations while eliminating over 8 40-hour work weeks and over 250,000 user clicks. I also found that errors arose from foreground object ambiguity. In other words, crowd workers were reliable. So given that ambiguity is still a problem, this inspired the following research question, which is, how does the familiarity of the data influence perceived ambiguity of the foreground object? So So let me paint a picture of why this is a compelling question. Given an image, we can ask a very cheap question to the crowd. Is the segmentation task ambiguous? If the answer is no, go ahead and collect the segmentation, spend extra money and time. However, if the answer is yes, it's ambiguous, let's go ahead and skip collecting that segmentation. So this is the idea, and in fact, when we did this, our goal was to actually build a classifier to automatically predict this. So we were interested in seeing how well does, what happens when we ask the crowd to answer this question. So again, we collected 5 crowd votes per image on our biomedical images, our unfamiliar images, and on familiar everyday images, and we instructed the crowd workers to answer the following. If we asked multiple people to draw the boundary of a single object in a given image, do you think all people would pick the same object? For each image, we established the ground truth, and in particular, we looked at whether the crowdsourced segmentations, if at least 2 of them differed by over 50% pixel overlap with the ground truth, then we deemed the image ambiguous, otherwise we deemed it unambiguous. We also established a crowd prediction, so in other words, what we established was that if the majority of the crowd workers said the image was ambiguous, label it as ambiguous, otherwise label it as unambiguous. And pictorially, one of the findings we saw is that the crowd workers spent on average 23.4 seconds to vote on everyday images and 28.2 seconds to vote on biomedical images. This result actually follows what we observed in the previous study, where more time is spent on images that are recognized. So we showed here some our results pictorially. So what you can see highlighted in red are when there's an agreement between the crowd and the ground truth, the crowd perception and the ground truth. And what you can see now encircled in red is that the crowd fails to recognize the ambiguity of the foreground object more often for everyday images than biomedical images. And with this finding, just to highlight why we think we observed this, we believe that it's actually that the familiarity causes the perceived ambiguity. We also found when there's incorrectly perceived, when images are incorrectly perceived as ambiguous, that unfamiliar biomedical images are more often misperceived as ambiguous than familiar everyday images. Why might this be? Well, we suspect that it's because the unfamiliarity is causing people to perceive ambiguity. So to summarize from this research question, what we found is that popular perception is contrasting what's observed in practice. So crowd workers perceived images to be less ambiguous than in actuality for everyday images. Crowd workers perceived images to be more ambiguous than actuality for biomedical images. And also, crowd workers took more time to vote on familiar everyday images than unfamiliar biomedical images. Perhaps, again, recognition is causing them to take more time. So at this point, I'd like to summarize the key findings from our 3 research questions. First, what we found is that crowd workers make significantly fewer errors on unfamiliar images than in familiar images. Second, crowd workers produce significantly higher quality segmentations with significantly less effort when images are less familiar. And third, crowd workers often incorrectly predict tasks that are ambiguous for unfamiliar images and unambiguous for familiar images. And I want to leave you with 3 take-home points. In particular, I would encourage people when designing crowdsourcing tasks to consider tuning the data familiarity and understanding the influence of that familiarity. So in particular, if we're doing crowdsourcing tasks and we have someone whose native language is not English being asked to do a task in English, perhaps we'll find different outcomes if that's a foreign language versus their original language. Second take-home point is that perhaps we have now an improved segmentation method. In particular, take your images, rotate them upside down, and then crowdsource the task. Finally, I'd like to throw out there that what we found is errors typically arose from ambiguity rather than an unreliable crowd. And with that said, I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Definitely have time for questions.
So thank you. I'm just wondering, in the case of familiarity, whether there would be tasks for which you require more expertise, let's say for the medical images, in which case familiarity, say, with what means what's cancer or not, so on, a crowd might not have. In which case, I would think familiarity would provide better segmentation. So is there some sort of general ideas that you would have of when familiarity would be helpful and when it would not be helpful? What kind of tasks?
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent question, and it's something that I think needs to be considered when designing the task is when it does and does not. So for example, this is clearly, if you have, so what I proposed is exploring the generic, just given an image, demarcate the boundary of the most prominent object. So you don't need comprehension of it. But there's another thing called semantic segmentation, which is you need to demarcate a specified known object. So say, find the dog. Or if you're a doctor, find the tumor. And so in that case, you need recognition to complete the task. So absolutely, I think there's cases where you don't and you do. And I think it's valuable to understand when does that recognition, when does that familiarity help versus hurt your outcomes. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vinit from Design Lab UC San Diego. Thank you for such a wonderful talk. It was really informative. So I'm curious, so one takeaway that I have from this talk is, if we know that people might be performing badly at some segmentation tasks or even classification or labeling tasks, maybe we should allow them to skip it. And there seems to be parallel work in the field of ensemble classifiers, where if you allow people to actually skip rather than having them vote, or just allowing them to abstain, can help us build ensemble classifiers which are much more powerful than when we have results or labels from all the workers. So are you looking to combine with that kind of work in any way?
Let me make sure I understand what you're asking. So you're basically saying if a worker feels that he or she is not confident in what he or she is doing, then he or she should skip. So I think it's an interesting idea. What I want to throw out there is that when I started, I spoke about how we use the crowd to demarcate the boundaries of biomedical images, which our study shows the crowd perceives it as ambiguous. They don't know how to do. But they also produce segmentations that match experts. So whether or not a person feels confident, I think, is not really addressing, could they still be helpful? And so I think that that's a counterpoint. But I do think what you state is an important thought to consider, which is, should you actually force someone to do a task? And could they succeed if they were asked to do something they're not confident in doing?
Right, because there are definitely domains that come to mind where that might actually be true.
Absolutely.
Okay. It seems like ambiguity arose here because the question was sort of ambiguous, like the term object, what does that mean? And in this context, like, maybe they're correct that one egg is one object rather than 3 eggs. And maybe that doesn't arise because in the biomedical images, it is one object, but maybe an expert there would think like the nucleus of the cell is a different object. So it seems like expertise is maybe hurting in this case because we're looking for something, but their prior knowledge may be correct, but they're interpreting the question differently.
Absolutely. So the example you just gave was actually written in the paper. So the question, I don't think there's a question, but I think you're exactly hitting on the point, which is when is expertise going to help you? And in this case, we want to remove that expertise to actually get better results.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for a great talk, and I really appreciate taking the human into account, and this is a really interesting result. One comment is, do you think that there's something to bring back to cognitive science from here?
Yes, so the prior literature I've seen has predominantly focused on the recognition task. So at the beginning I spoke about a child recognizing a mother versus when the image is upright and flipped. The prior work that I've explored has always talked about how recognition actually causes the workers to take, or the person to take more time to do something. And what we found is people are actually taking less time when you remove the recognition. So I do think that there would be an interesting, if I were to meet up with psychologists and say, can we sit down and do this? I would be interested in seeing when does that actually make you do something faster versus slower.
That'll be terrific. And one more question, since you mentioned text, do you have some thoughts on how this could be used for language, the insights that you have here?
For the familiarity of language, so I mentioned, what's your first language? So I think that that's it's assumed English is a common language for everyone, but that's not the case. So I do think, knowing what someone's first language is and considering that as one example. Certainly offline, I'm guessing we're running out of time, but I could talk to you more about that.
do one quick one.
Hi, very great talk. I have a question is, do workers like it when you flip the images? Because, I mean, what I'm thinking is practically, maybe some expert workers you have, they don't like it, images put it that way, so they leave. And those maybe 10 of expert workers is a big hurt, I think. So do you do any surveys or get feedback from them? Thank you.
Thank you. Regarding whether they like it or not, we didn't explicitly explore that, but I'd be happy to talk offline. I believe Mariners sitting up here got all the emails we got from the workers, and so we can speak with her and see how people respond to them.
All right, great. Let's thank Donna again. So the next